This is Aaron with Seven Figure RIA, and we help companies grow their revenue, specifically financial advisory firms. The way we do this is by starting in the big picture. The first thing we do is try to diagnose or look at the current client acquisition model. And so I'm going to break down the frame, the ideas, which we start with when we're looking at a client acquisition model, specifically for financial advisory companies. And so I'm going to start with the big picture, acquisition. This is the frame we want to set when we're diagnosing or looking at potentially diagnosing problems in the acquisition model is, are there leads coming in? That's a kind of a binary question. If they've got leads coming in, the next thing we want to look at is the target audience. Are we looking at an ideal client profile of these leads? Are they matching the ideal client profile that we have written? Is there a written ideal client profile that we can reflect and compare? That's a good place to start. A lot of companies miss the mark with their ideal client profile. The reason they miss the mark is because they're not using an acquisition model. They're not using a system that appeals to those people. They're not looking at their buyer persona. They're not looking at the companies that those people are currently working with and comparing what they're doing to what that buying persona is already using. And the next thing we want to look at after that point is the nurture process. So the people who maybe are inside of the lead cycle or inside of the buying cycle to some degree of the company, what is the way or the channel that they're going to graduate into a buyer or disqualify and not become a buyer? Because they're in the channel for the purpose of qualifying. And qualifying is on a binary. It's really not a gradient. When you want to grow revenue, when you want to align with people or not align. After the nurture process, when there isn't an issue here, so there's always going to be ways that you can criticize your current model. None of us have a perfect client acquisition process. A better way of framing it is a sales engine. If there's a sales engine that's functioning, pushing people into a sales call or a discovery call, a disqualification call, then you have a functioning, at least acquisition model. So you're bringing people in. Looking at the monetization model now, or the monetization idea, how are you going to sell and how is selling being framed? The first place you start with is disqualifying or discovery. Discovery, in person, you're having this with the prospective client, diagnosing issues, looking at their current situation, and ultimately finding out if they're going to be a client. Do they have the assets? Do they have the need for you? Do they merit the fee that you're going to charge them? That's what you want to look at with discovery. Disqualifying, these are things that you can actually use in the nurture process to expedite the disqualifying process so that you're not talking to in a discovery meeting people who are not qualified. So we really like using the disqualifying in the nurture process, but it can also be done as part of the sales process because these people, if you think about leads are coming in, when leads come in, that's when you can start to look at, are these people qualified? Are they not qualified? Are they showing up to sales calls? Are they not showing up to sales calls? After this point, presentation of an offer. That's the real big next step, the thing that's missing here. And the reason I'm keeping this blank is because this is either one more meeting or two more meetings. This is the place where someone turns into a client or they don't turn into a client. You should have post-discovery meeting, at least a 60% close rate or more, because these are people who you've qualified as they have a need. These are people who fit your ideal client profile or your target asset minimum. They have certain parameters which make them a good fit. And you need to know that you're closing the business or your advisors are closing the business that your company is putting in front of them or that they're putting in front of themselves. And so if you're thinking about this on a per advisor basis, what you really want to look at historical close rates, what are their close rates now? And then are they improving? Are they decreasing or are they getting worse? Hopefully they're not getting worse, and it's rare that that's the case. But you really want to make sure that if it's getting worse, is it because of a bad discovery or is it because of a bad sales process? The way that you can look at that just quickly is this is a common problem. Discovery has to fit, okay, Is there a need? Nobody's going to buy anything if there's not a need that is presented or identified in the discovery meeting and then sold to them in the sales meeting. So that's the biggest thing that you want to look for in this discovery. If that's a checkbox, there is a need being found, then the sales process. You're not reiterating that the need is there. You're not finding out that the person needs to solve the problem, or you're not making that pain high enough so that if they don't solve the problem, they're not going to reach their end goal, and presenting it in a way that is allowing the person to say yes 60% of the time, 6 out of 10 times. So that's the big thing after to look at when you're closing. At least those are numbers that we've seen at scale. So retention, this is the next step after someone becomes a client. You want to keep those clients. Clients on average in the financial advisory world stick around for a long time. What is your average client retention? We have advisors who are our clients who have 25-year client retention. We have advisors who've got 7-year client retention because for one reason or another, the process is missing what we look at as a good planning process. And this just means annual or twice a year breakdowns of what the person has going on in their life. Are you meeting the person's expectations for the amount of times you're reaching out in between these planning meetings? Are you addressing the key concerns as they arise when markets or when situations arise that are macro and people look at them and they look at the financial plan or their current 401k? When those events happen, are you calling them? Are they being touched by other members at the firm? This is a major key of planning. So what is the process of communicating with a client and meeting with a client, putting hours with an advisor for each client? And that's part of our planning process. This also comes into potential what other industries look at as additional ways of selling services. You could look at, identify that the person needs additional things during these planning meetings. So these should not be a sunk cost. They should really be an opportunity to potentially provide more service, potentially get referrals. This could be a client acquisition or a lead acquisition model in itself. This is where a lot of advisors, if they're not using external marketing partners, this is what drives a lot of business for advisors, is that planning process. So after discovery, the plan is built. The next 3 to 6 months, leads are getting gathered during this planning process. So client retention model also favors when there's an improvement of services, improvement of deliverables. In other words, when someone meets with an advisor in 2020, the service that they're getting could be a B plus. When they meet with them in 2025, it's an A minus. There's improvement for the client in the overall service. And this is something that is a little bit more difficult to track. You can have client surveys, but a good thing that you can ask yourself, are clients calling you with needs? Are they asking questions that lead you or lead advisors to believe that there's an issue that they're calling about? Or are clients calling when there's a birthday of the advisor or someone invited them to an event? The reason for a client calling is really dependent on the planning process. And that is where we've seen just over time, a lot of the retention start to shift towards longer retention when people have that increased services and the increased offer to the current clients. Your client acquisition model may not be broken. There may be parts that you can improve. I want you to think about the way that you're currently bringing clients into your business as a ladder. They're starting at the first rung. So they have to get at least onto the ladder, and that's your client acquisition model. That is what's getting, or lead acquisition model is a much better way of phrasing it. That's where people, they volunteer or they opt in or they receive some sort of message that gets them into the funnel that they have to respond to. After that point, that's when they start to disqualify themselves. You start to nurture them. So you're presenting a variety of things that lead them to the next step, which is another rung in the ladder. Think of it as the middle of the ladder, and that's monetization. That's where you're bringing them into the sales cycle. So they're in a sales call or they're in a discovery call. After that point, when they're qualified, they get a little bit farther up the ladder and they get booked to, or they'd book themselves onto the next implementation call or the next presentation call where you're discussing all your findings, you're going through exactly what the process is to work with you and why it's a benefit to them, hitting on their pain points. When you're at that point, you've reached close to the top of the ladder when they sign the document. It's not the end of the ladder because you always want to think about the client retention. That is still a component of the ladder that a lot of people miss. Thinking about the next step
What is your client experience like as after you've brought them into the funnel? That's another video I'll walk you through, but big picture.
What are you doing that's changing
Their life. Is it more plans? Is it less plans? Is it more offers, more insurance? Hopefully, it's not just more insurance, but you want to have something that's graduating them to client level 1, 2, or 3, from long-term client to lifetime client, something where they've accepted that you're going to be their advisor for life, or your firm is going to be an advisor for life, and they're going to refer you a ton of business. And what does that look like on the ladder?
depends on your firm, depends on a lot of other things, but you need to know it needs to be on the ladder somewhere.
So you have a starting point. Out a starting point, never know where you're going. Without a starting point, you'll never know where you are. Without putting it on the map somewhere, or at least having a map, a roadmap of that client journey. Without that, you'll never know where someone is, or multiple people won't be able to say, oh, John Smith is client level 2. Oh, Jane Iyer, author, is level 3. She's done some great stuff. She has this amount of money invested with us. She's referred us these many clients. You need to have those things as you grow, because people need to be able to look other than you with your infinite knowledge of current clients, find where people are. So, food for thought. Check out the rest of our videos. If you want to apply some of this stuff, I recommend a board like Miro, but something where you have a blank piece of paper, you just start big picture. What are the steps that get someone from a prospect to a client, or get someone from raw to a prospect? Those things are very helpful. And then finally, a client to elite client. That's what we covered today.
You can do the same on a blank piece of paper. You can do the same using a software like this that just gives you a good roadmap
so that you can help other advisors on your team grow. You can iterate this and improve as you go.
And so ultimately, this is about growing over time. Take it, enjoy,
apply. Let me know what you think in the comments.